Welcome to another Final Fantasy project from OBS Studios. I'm the Ikran writer, and this one actually happens to be a one-shot, which I have made since my early years on fanfiction.net and DeviantArt and whatnot. And this one actually happens to be based on the original Final Fantasy. But I'm going to add a special twist to this. So this is like a short emotional fic that I created several years back, which I almost lost during my early years in fanfiction. So, let's get this thing started as I go with the origins of the Warrior of Light, or as I like to call him, the puppet. Alright, Revelations of a Warrior. I don't know in Final Fantasy, the Juggernaut belongs to Squeenix. As I've previously mentioned in Dissidia Shadowgate, I'm not much of a Warrior of Light fan. However, I did have this dream a while back about him several years ago, so I thought I'd give it a try with this one-shot. Heck, at that time, this was my first one-shot in Final Fantasy fic, around this time. So what better way to start than with the original, right? It's kind of like a mashup with the original Final Fantasy with a touch of Crystalis-esque style. Hope you all enjoy this short, though emotional fic. And I should warn you, this is going to be a little depressing, so for those of you who are sensitive, I suggest you leave immediately. This is going to get very emotional here. The demon Chaos was the culprit for bringing the peaceful world to ruin. It didn't happen overnight, however. In fact, it took nearly 100 years for everything to turn inside out. The evil lord led his forces during the century-long war, and everyone and everything were dying all around. The world suffered so much damage that its axis shifted and a new evolution happened. All of the surviving creatures began to mutate and wreak havoc to the remaining inhabitants. What was worse was that chaos awakened the 4 elemental archfiends. The despot of earth Lich, the autarch of fire Marilith, the mighty fiend of water Kraken, and the powerful fiend of wind Tiamat. Never wanting to repeat their mistakes, everyone worked together to build an enormous tower in the sky. Most of the people lived there for a century, while others attempted and failed to rebuild their once destroyed lives. Their lands were still in peril, and once the tower was activated, it foretold a prophecy. A warrior of light was awakened to put an end to the conflict, once and for all. The warrior woke up inside the entrance of Chaos's lair. Even though it was only a few minutes, he felt like he slept forever. As his eyes cleared, he sat up slowly and surveyed the damage. Before it was knocked out, there was an explosion. He was attempting to save Cid the Lufane. Following a wise sage's prophecy, Lucan, 4 of them existed, each with a different element. But Cid wandered here without the warrior knowing it. Unlike the others, Cid was sort of a father figure to him, giving life advice and various skills. Cid was the creator of the 4 warriors of light. These particular 2 were perfect copies of each other. With his total amnesia, the warrior never knew about his past, his family, his true home, or his origins. He never felt close to anyone except Cid and Princess Sarah of Cornelia. With many people by his side, including the other 2's utmost support, he stopped at nothing to uphold his duties, regardless of how dire and dangerous they were. Alas, he was not able to save his friend. It all started when the warrior found him just inside the enemy's stronghold. "Cid!" The warrior was running toward him, but he raised an arm. "Stay back!" he said in a stern tone. "I can feel him. Chaos is near. He's planning something to stop us from progressing. He's very cunning when it comes to his tricks." Unlike Cid, the warrior didn't feel anything. Everything was dark and quiet. He did sense chaos, but not exactly what Cid was worried about. What is it? We must use extreme caution. We have to end this now. We? You're not expecting to fight him, are you? He said with worry. Unlike the warrior from the series, I gave him a lot more emotion and personality. Like, seriously, one of the reasons I don't like the warrior of light that much is because he lacks personality and development. He's always so stoic. He's so bland. Before he got his answer, the ground started to shake. Then at the tunnel ahead, something started to glow, and it was aiming toward the warrior. Look out! Sid knocked him out of the way before it shot out a volley of hellfire. He used his windshield to block the onslaught, but he knew he wouldn't hold it for long. He started to weaken when his strength was giving way. Warrior of Light, this is your chance. Go now. I'll take care of this monstrosity. Fight chaos without me. You must leave. Now. No, I can't. You're the strongest man I know. I can't do this without you. You must. Trust me. It's the only way. The warrior then had a dilemma. Not much time to make a decision. All his life he experienced nothing but death and war. This was all he knew. The war had been raging for 100 years, yet he wasn't there to spare anyone's lives until recently. He realized the prices the people paid to keep themselves alive, through the loss and pain they had suffered. He couldn't possibly let this happen to Sid. Not now, not ever. The warrior charged toward it and raised his shield as well. For an instant there was a flash of light as he made contact. Like Sid, he too was having a hard time repelling it. With all his strength he used his shield to shoot out a volley of hallowed light, which weakened the unknown enemy. Suddenly it started to illuminate. The warrior immediately lowered his shield and looked in shock. As they were about to turn away, both the warrior and Sid were caught in the explosion. As he came to, the warrior kept moaning his name, hoping he'd still be alive somewhere. Son. His eyes shot wide as he heard Sid call him. His voice was really faint, indicating that he didn't have much time to live. The warrior frantically searched in every pile of debris, assuming he was trapped beneath it. He eventually uncovered his face and Sid choked on the dust filling his throat. Oh, thank goodness! Thank the goddess! Is that you? Sid spoke with hardly any energy to keep his eyes open. Yes, Sid. I'm here. Sid's breathing became more rampant. Heavy rocks punctured his lungs and his chest was in so much pain. The warrior tried to calm him down some. Sid, I'll go get help. We'll return to Cornelia and... No. There's no time for me anymore. I've served my purpose and fulfilled Lucan's prophecy. Almost startling the warrior amongst the silence. You mustn't talk. Save your strength, Sid. You must hear this. I have a few confessions I want to make. He knew that what he was about to give him would be very tragic. You were not the only one chosen to end this conflict. There were 3 others, just like you, who awoke the same time you did. If I wasn't the only one, how come I've never met them? Did, but they weren't the same. They were all defeated by Chaos and his minions. They each had different capabilities and they stuck together through thick and thin. Then they've fallen. As they did, Chaos used them to feed his archfiends, each one more powerful than the last. You fought them twice. Skin was very pale. He felt his heart ache. How could he do such a thing? Wait. If there were 4 archfiends, and 3 other warriors fell prey to them, who was the last one? It's quite saddening. He was the one you fought when you started your journey. The others were waiting, but this one was a failed experiment. That was why he was so weak compared to the others. You see, when Chaos watched you defeat the Fiend of Earth, he wanted to make them stronger. How he did it was unforgivable. His archfiends absorbed their powers, making them more of a threat. You were the lucky one who didn't go through this painful process. After you defeated them a second time, their souls were freed and reunited inside you. That was why they said thank you to me. I don't get upset. It wasn't your fault. But there is more. You've been hit with setback after setback since you were different from many villagers. You hardly fitted in until they found out who you were and what you were capable of. But Sarah saw you differently after you rescued her. You both personally became attached with each other, but she knew that you were one of a kind. However, she didn't want to say it because she didn't want to embarrass you. The warrior remembered what Sarah said to him. He was different than everyone else, and she somehow knew that. You were unique because you're not human, and neither were the three warriors. What? You had no memory, not even a name to call your own. You had no life until you awoke in that cave. You were our last hope because I created you. Always have faith not in what you are, but who you are. Sid? Sid! Warrior watched him close his eyes after he said his final words. He realized now that he wasn't born in this world, but created. All this time he was used as a mere tool. Nevertheless, Sid was his creator, and the warrior was there to carry on his wish to end Chaos's reign for good. With new determination and a broken heart, he vowed to continue what Sid and his fallen pawns have started. He then reminisced all the times in which Sid was not just his maker, but a true parent as well. Father. He laid him to rest before he pressed on to defeat Chaos. So you've come. Deep voice was heard through a darkened area. The warriors saw a demon sitting on a large throne with 4 muscular arms, red soul-piercing eyes, long tail, fangs, humongous bat-like wings, and 3 sets of horns protruding from his head. At last, he finally met the representation of evil himself, Chaos. The warrior nodded in acknowledgement. Then the behemoth spoke. The last warrior. I shall tell you something before you perish. 100 years ago, I've driven this rigid world into its own destruction, causing civilization to be destroyed. As it happened, life started to take a new form. The world of ruin came to be, and every living thing is transformed into bloodthirsty organisms. And the elemental fiends have been awakened, devastating everything in sight. However, there were still survivors who have defied my rule. As most of them soared above the world like cowards, Sid created 4 warriors to set it into balance. But the best part was, they weren't human, which means they were puppets who never had a will of their own. Not even you. You're wrong. Sid did make us, but we still made our own decisions, chose our own paths. We were only here because we were destined to restore peace again. We may not have been born, but at least we, and I, had a purpose. Yes, and your purpose was to be mere tools of war. You each had no life, no meaning, no past. So why did you do it? Regardless, your efforts will be all for naught. What would happen if you'd ever defeat me? Do you think life would return, be given a second chance? Only the miserable humans will survive, while the rest of the world would still be torn. There will be nothing left. True, evil will be vanquished, and all of life affected by it would die out. But needless to say, it shall stay this way forever. dark and barren. The bottom line is, I started this conflict, and you would finish it after my demise. Indeed, you are the tool of war I've been longing to have, the true force of darkness, the ruthless mannequin that Sig created, a mere prototype without a heart or a soul, who grew stronger and more valuable with each battle won. You're lying! Chaos's voice softened. Of course, you would prevent this disaster. If you would join me, that is. Never! The warrior in his rage slashed the demon's chest. He felt no pain, but he did feel his cuts starting to bleed. He looked down, examined the wound with his fingers. Blood! He paused and spoke in his fury. I will not be defeated by the likes of you, a pathetic little tool. I offered you forgiveness, and this is how you return the favor. You're all selfish, self-centered beings, and you shall pay! Battle between the warrior and chaos was nothing anyone would process. A demigod facing a mere mortal who's not actually human. Fight that was so unsurmountable that it would live on through the millennia, if anyone would be crazy enough to believe it. Questions began racing through the warrior's mind. Is chaos right? Will the world not recover after this moment? Is this my true self as a tool of destruction? Was this mission all a lie? And he felt his energy leave him as if he couldn't fight anymore. He made one last daring move. The warrior stabbed Chaos directly into his heart. Just then, the warrior and Chaos had a brief moment staring into each other's eyes, almost as if they were looking into their souls. Quickly retreated his blade and watched his nemesis falter. Chaos fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding heart. The gate started to collapse shortly afterward. Before the warrior disappeared in a flash of light, he said to his final speech, This war has finally come to an end. Warrior ended up outside of Chaos's lair. While the demon was suffering from his own demise, so was his den. It was finally over. The century-long conflict had finally come to a close. He took a deep sigh of relief. Watched the cave turn into rubble, but something was still in his mind. Chaos's words. What would happen if you'd ever defeat me? The world would still be torn. There will be nothing left. Sure enough, he was right. Everywhere he looked, he saw nothing but endless deserted wastelands. All of the vegetation was dead. There was no wildlife roaming the fields. It was like going through an infinite desert. Everything was silent and there was no life. Is this my reward? I defeated chaos and ended the battle, and the world is still destroyed? This is nothing but true darkness. Then reminisced of Cosmos and how she perished thanks to the god of discord. Then he remembered Farian's dream of wanting a world filled with flowers, where there is always peace and no fighting, because in a broken world, nothing grows back. Cosmos, if only you were here. Choked on a sob as he sunk to his knees. He felt like his body weighed like 10 behemoths, and he felt his body shaking and breaking out in a cold sweat. He lost all hope, all feeling. Nothing mattered to him now. He even ignored his screaming conscience when he took off his helmet and set it in front of him. He even laid out his possessions all around him, even his gill. This is my last stand. He started to shed some tears and took out a sword. I must end this. Suddenly thunder crashed and great clouds started to gather. Then there was a huge downpour, almost as if countless angels were weeping. He pointed the holy blade toward his heart, and with his hand still quivering, he could barely hold on to it. He squeezed his eyes shut and made a few tries to stab himself. But then, a shrill voice stopped him. She was pushing his hands and the blade away. No! That voice belonged to Sarah. Little did he know he was a few yards away from Cornelia Castle. The warrior was still struggling, trying to escape from the princess's grip. I must do this. I won't let you. You're the only friend I've ever had. The world would never be the same without you. Neither will I. She was sobbing her eyes out when her voice started to crack. She can't possibly lose the warrior. He was her all-time hero, her idol, her knight in shining armor. How could it be that this shining knight was plunging his way into darkness? Sid, please stop. I'm too old. It's like chaos. It's like what Chaos said. I'm nothing but an asset for destruction and evil. I've sacrificed everything. I'm begging you. Please trust me. You're not what you think you are. Even though everything's dead, there'll still be life. Give it some time. His head drooped as he dropped his sword. How could he possibly escape from his sorrow if he can't take his own life? Sid, I need you to be strong, as you always have been. I want you to. Look me in the eyes and say that you'll stay with me. I know how you must be feeling, having no home of your own with no support, no one to look up to. But you still have me. I mean, if you would slain yourself, you won't have a peaceful life you've always wanted. But the warrior didn't budge. She cuffed his chin and forcefully raised it. Please, for the sake of Cosmos, look at me. He slowly opened them and saw Sarah with her blood-red eyes and her skewed face underneath his eyelids. It almost sounded like a full-fledged zombie remembering its lost love. She hugged and squeezed him, trying to soothe him under her embrace, and he still didn't come around. He held her hand loosely as she led him back to his so-called home. Later that night, the castle was heavily guarded. Foot soldiers were at almost every chamber. The Lord and Lady of Cornelia decreed for Sid to be under lockdown till he was willing to become the strong, just person he once knew. While most of the noblemen were asleep, however, he somehow managed to get past the wary guardsmen. He was climbing down his tower with ease as he walked away from the constant restrictions he endured. He was still not wearing his helmet. Even his armor and weapons were confiscated. In the distance, he saw an old bare tree. He walked to it and decided to hang himself amongst one of the branches simply by using a rope he managed to take. After he made a very tight noose, he tossed it over and pulled it tight. Still wearing his vacant look, he never spoke a word before he was about to do the unthinkable. As he was stepping closer, the front of his foot felt something soft and tender. It almost felt like skin belonging to a newborn bird. Sure enough, it was. It was crying for help. He noticed that it must have fallen out from his nest. Nest? That means its mother must be here. If so, then there's still life. He then started to hear a robin crying for its chick. She was too weak that she couldn't carry it back to its home. With a warm heart, he picked it up and looked at the helpless baby. After a few minutes, it calmed down, knowing that it was safe in safe hands. He slowly nodded and gently placed it in the nest. The robin treaded to it and nuzzled at the chick. For the first time, they were reunited. Sid watched the small family with glee. He almost felt the same way when he was first taken into Cornelia. He now had a home, a family. Even though he can't remember his own past, he can always start his life with a new one. Just then the robin flew away. The warrior continued to gaze into the nest. He never saw any type of animal so happy, so loved. He realized now that not all of nature was always evil. After a few moments, the sun began to rise, and the robin flew back holding a flower in her beak. She treaded and flew to Sid's shoulder. She chirped to get his attention and gave him the flower. It was a newly bloomed rose. He took it and gazed at its beauty. He felt his head clearing, his heart warmed, his eyes no longer looking dead. There was even color returning to his face. The warrior once again returned to the light. He walked to a garden full with flowers, fruits, and vegetables. There was even a small pond with a tiny waterfall filled with all kinds of fish. In the center of it was Sarah watering the crops. With his hands behind his back, he marched up to her and spoke her name. Sarah! She looked up and saw Sid, no longer looking distant and devastated. She stood and walked slowly to him. What is it that you have? He brought out his left hand where he was holding the rose, and he gave it to her. You are correct, Sarah. Peace has returned to the world, at last. And this is the proof that it had. Life did find a way to be restored again. She took the rose and held it to her heart. Sid, you've returned. I'm so happy for you. But does that mean you'll stay? Yes, Sarah. She then heard tweeting behind him. Sid! Are those real birds? He took out his right hand holding the nest with the robin and her newborn. He held it and placed it gently in a miniature tree, which was full of lush, fertile leaves. I assumed that they deserved to be put into a better place. They wouldn't survive on their own in this unforgiving wilderness. Because they are not volatile, they needed a home. Just like I do. She grinned from ear to ear. She never felt this glad before. Now she and Sid knew they were no longer alone. As they kissed and embraced each other for the first time, Sid finally felt at peace and smiled. Phew, I finally got that out of the way. Didn't take as long as I thought. Never knew one-shots could be so simple. Which sometimes they are, but they're sometimes long to do. Complicated. I've done this more often since then. Even though I sometimes disagree with the warrior's motives, particularly in Dissidia, it definitely needs to have someone and somewhere to come home to. Especially for someone who literally has no identity. For the first time, the warrior feels whole and has a place to call his own without an endless conflict. Think of Data from Star Trek, but only better. I tried to make the Archfiends comparable to Dragonia's finest four that were featured in Crystalis. Carnine is similar to Lich, with the exception of the Thunder Elemental. Sabira was Marilith. Mado represented Kraken. General Kelbesk was Tiamat, and Chaos was almost like Emperor Dragon. Also, the story was loosely based off of the Runaway game with the 100-year conflict and a single fighter, comparable to Simia, who's willing to put everything right. Those were minor details compared to those for Final Fantasy. Lastly, I'd really like to thank my best friend Serb for editing this. I would never have written it if it wasn't for her info and advice on the original game. Hope you enjoyed this fic, and I'll see you next time. Before I go, I want to show you guys another digital art that I've created way back. I used to think or hope that Pokemon would have a crossover with Final Fantasy, because Serb and I, back then, we were discussing and brainstorming ideas if Pokemon were crossing over with Final Fantasy IV. But at that time, I decided to create several images, including this. Here we are. Yeah, I call this the Light Duo. And as you can see, the Warrior of Light is holding a crystal, and he has Ampharos as his partner, because, Ampharos is the light Pokemon. There's the Warrior of Light. And he actually has Ampharos Sight for his Mega Evolution. So, if you compare them side by side, they're very much alike, as they're like photokinetics. And of course, there's a big sun shining next to them. And it's kind of almost like a shiny Ampharos, as he illuminated from the sunlight itself, just like the crystal and the warrior. I kind of liked him without the helmet, though. Kind of reminds me of Cecil, but not a huge fan of the Puppet of Light. So, Until I do like the holiday one-shot for Wintertime in Salamand, this is pretty much the end of the Final Fantasy series. My Final Fantasy podfics. So, I'm pretty much done with Final Fantasy Juggernaut. Excepting the holiday special, of course, which hopefully I'll do in the future when winter comes around. So, this is the Ecron Writer signing out, and I'll see you all next time. Later.